Why I said it.
Indeed. And since we made that bumper, he's made less and less sense. But the next guest on the Mother of All Christmas podcasts makes a lot of sense. In fact, he is one of the most acute observers, analysts of the economic crisis that we've been through and to a very large extent are still in, and a man whose prognosis for the future of the economic system that we enjoy or endure is a very, very sombre one. He is the Professor of Economics at SOAS, Costas Lapavitsas. He is the author of a new book called Profiting Without Producing, published by Verso, and I'm glad to say he joins us now. Professor Costas, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
The crisis that we have lived through since the crash in 2008, according to George Osborne, the Chancellor, in the House this week in the autumn statement, which was neither in autumn nor much of a statement, is past. Do you buy that?
What can one say? The crisis, if you take a global perspective, is certainly not over in Europe for a start, because what happened in Europe, in the Eurozone and so on, is very much part of the global crisis, and that is still going on. So, self-evidently, the crisis is not over if one takes a global perspective. But even in Britain, when you look more closely, yes, it's true that the situation is not as acute, nearly as acute as it was in 2008 and 2009. But if this situation that we're going through at the moment is a non-crisis situation, then that doesn't augur very well for the future or for what the British economy might do in the near term. So, no, I would say that the British economy might not be in acute crisis, but it is in the doldrums and it is in serious trouble.
And a lot of individual British people are indeed in an economic crisis. First of all, the austerity, the savage reductions in public expenditure have laid waste many vital public services for millions of people. Hundreds of thousands have been thrown onto the unemployment queue, some of them finding their way back into the private sector, but this time in part-time jobs, in insecure jobs, 0 hours contracts, much lower wages than they were earning hitherto. And even in the public finances, the Chancellor has not only not succeeded in balancing the books by 2015, which is what he said this was all for, but has just announced, and indeed as Ed Balls put it yesterday, invited us to congratulate him on his new plan to balance the books by 2019.
When Osborne took over as Chancellor, Britain had a deficit of the order of 11%. This was very big. Osborne and his government decided to deal with it through a process of austerity applied over many years. The hope was that the British economy would come back fairly strongly in due course, and therefore the books would be balanced pretty quickly. That hasn't turned out to be the case. Austerity applied in order to deal with this problem has created the situation of very weak growth for several years, and this weak growth will continue. Now, growth this year and possibly next will not be as weak as originally thought for two reasons. The first and most important reason is, of course, the Bank of England. The Bank of England has been providing plenty of liquidity at very low interest rates. So he has been allowing the banks to start the process which they engaged in several years back, which is to provide funds for housing and so on. And certain parts of London are already, in effect, going through a bubble. So what we've seen is a return to the bad old days to a certain extent, which has given a boost, a temporary boost to the economy. Second factor that has caused slightly higher growth than Osborne originally projected is, of course, that spending has picked up a bit because people are borrowing more. It's the same mechanism. People are borrowing more and they're drawing down their savings. But wages have remained effectively, real wages have remained effectively stagnant. This is a recovery based on stagnant real wages, no pickup of the productive sector, no expansion of investment. It's just people spending a bit more because they can borrow a bit more and they draw down their savings, and it's also a game played in the housing market. This is a very unstable and very unsatisfactory recovery. It's a sign that austerity is not working, contrary to what Osborne is saying. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Precisely because the recovery is so weak and so unstable, it will take him years to balance the books on this basis, as he has admitted himself. And the public debt will continue rising, even including 2015. Basically, Britain received a major shock back in 2008. Gross domestic product has not recovered yet. We still produce less than we used to, and this will continue to be the case for years and years. So for the average British person, for the British family, people in the street, things are not going to look very good for many years to come.
Well, let's look at the underlying reasons for that, and that brings us to your book, Profiting Without Producing, as I said, published by Verso. You have a critique of capitalism. Capitalism isn't working in the sense that it isn't really producing. Tell us about that thesis.
My view is that capitalism, certainly mature capitalism, in other words, capitalism in the United States, in Germany, in Japan, in Britain and France, the historic seats of capitalism, as it were, have been transformed during the last 3 to 4 decades. And in particular, to use a term that has become increasingly deployed in recent years, this capitalism has financialized. Now, this is an awkward term in English, I understand, but it's widely used now. And it basically wants to capture the extraordinary rise of finance as a sector of the economy and as a set of economic activities, and also social and general other activities that have penetrated across the economy and across society and everyday life. So,
when did this start, this process?
We can locate the beginnings of financialization back in the 1970s. We can begin to see the early beginnings of it as the financial system of these countries, the mature countries, becomes increasingly deregulated, increasingly freed from the constraints applied on it previously.
This would be the end of the 70s, because I'm old enough to have lived through, as a political struggler, the 1970s. And in the 1970s, Britain was incomparable to now, in the sense that we had vast industries, coal mines, shipyards, steelworks, transport industries. We were, albeit limping badly, but we were still a demonstrably productive economy. And with the advent of Thatcher and Reagan implementing Thatcher Reaganomics, that's when I would have said things began to change. But you'd put it slightly earlier.
Yes, it's slightly earlier. Now, let me get one thing straight. Even in those 4 mature countries that I mentioned, the UK, the US, Germany and Japan, the productive base of capitalism still remains very much in evidence. I don't wish to say that these countries have become completely paper pushers or anything like that. This is a relative argument, right? It's not an argument about the complete destruction of manufacturing or anything like this. So it's a relative argument. Now, that has to do with the rise of finance. Now, if you want to locate that, you have to go before the emergence of Maggie Thatcher as a Prime Minister or Ronald Reagan as President of the United States. Actually starts a bit earlier. It starts with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 to 73, the first oil shock. That period which indicated the end of the golden era, as it were, the long post-war boom, which was a unique period in the history of capitalism. Then we entered a different period, very different period, the last 40 years, a period of weak growth, low, not increasing real wages, repeated crises, and an extraordinary growth of the financial system. This is really what financialization wishes to capture as a process, as a transformation. And it's in that sense that I discuss it in this new book that
Explain it
you mentioned.
in simple terms then to us non-economists. What does financialization actually look like?
In my view, and it's very much my view, but it's informed by the literature and by following these issues for many years. In my view, financialization must be understood as a historic transformation of the capitalist system. A major transformation. None of these transformations that you see every few decades. Not something that you see easily or every other year or whatever. It's a major historic transformation, and as such, it must be located in the fundamentals of how capitalism works. So I argue that financialization must be seen at the level of the productive enterprises, be they industrial or commercial enterprises to a certain extent, at the level of banks and other financial institutions, and at the level of households. And the last is the most vivid characteristic of financialization. So at the level of productive enterprises, what I'm arguing has happened is that big business has become increasingly independent of banks. It's not what people think. Big business is not increasingly dependent on banks to borrow, to finance investment. Actually, big business is sitting atop enormous piles of cash at the moment.
From their own profits.
From their own profits. So big business has actually is less dependent on banks than it used to be. Of course, it still uses banks, but it's less dependent on banks than it used to be. And it has actually financialized itself. It plays financial games itself. It looks towards the stock market. It engages in financial transactions. It makes financial profit itself. And often its top executives are remunerated in financial ways. So big business has become financialized in that regard. Now, connected with this is the transformation of banks. As this gap has opened up between big business and banks have had to reinvent themselves. They've had to look for new things to do. And lo and behold, they have reinvented themselves. Banks today are nothing like what they used to be back in the 60s and the 70s. Banks today make their profits less from borrowing and lending as that they used to, and more from transacting in open markets, from fees and commissions, from playing games in the financial markets on their own account. They also make profits increasingly from lending to households, not to businesses, but to households, individuals, and families. And the third transformation and the third trend is connected again to that, and it has to do with households. What we observe in the last 3 to 4 decades is an extraordinary phenomenon, whereby individual workers and workers' households have been sucked into the financial system, the formal financial system, both to borrow, but also to hold assets. And I say this because typically those of us who take a critical perspective look at the borrowing, and God knows that's very serious. But there are also assets the households now keep, and assets have to do with pensions, insurance. These are very important things in people's lives. And they have also been mobilized and taken over by the financial system. Now, I want to stress that because the financialization of the household is a remarkable feature of the transformation of Britain, for one thing, but also other mature countries.
Is that a bad thing? Is it a bad thing?
I would argue that it is a bad thing.
Tell us why.
We have to ask why it's happened. Now, an easy answer, which I don't accept, or at least I don't accept on one level, is to say it's because people's incomes have not been rising, and therefore people have had to borrow to sustain consumption, and therefore they've been sucked into the financial system. It's not quite like that. It's more complex than that. You will find when you look at the data that most people's borrowing is for mortgages. People borrow typically for mortgages. Unsecured borrowing, it can rise during certain times. Credit cards and so on. It can rise for certain periods, but that's not really what drives household borrowing. What drives household borrowing is housing. And that makes us think, what is it then that makes for financialization of the household? And my argument is, the most important element there is not so much what real wages are doing, but it is what public provision is doing. People borrow because they have a life to maintain. People are not businesses. They don't borrow because they want to produce profits. They borrow or get involved in financial activities because they've got a life to maintain, right? You've got basic needs to maintain. Now, public provision in the post-war period has been a very important part of maintaining a certain way of life. Public provision in health, in education, in housing, but also in transport and all sorts of other things. This public provision, as we know,
has shrunk,
has withdrawn, increasingly withdrawn. This is what Thatcher, Reagan, and every subsequent government pretty much has done. Now, as public provision is withdrawn, it's actually been replaced by private provision. What the public sector wouldn't do or refused to do, the private sector began to do. The remarkable thing is that this kind of private provision is now mediated by the financial system. The financial system has emerged as the mediator of housing, the mediator of education, often the mediator of health. It's an incredible thing in the history of capitalism, because the financial system has got no skill at all in doing all that. The financial system is basically a bunch of institutions, activities and assets that have to do with borrowing and lending money or playing games with money. Since when did the financial system become an expert in solving the housing problem of any country? And yet that's what we've got in this country and in other countries. So since these needs are now solved through private provision mediated by the financial system, you get all sorts of crises, all sorts of problematic results for the life of ordinary people, and you also get a transfer of people's income and people's money wealth straight into the pockets of banks. Banks have learned to make profit, not out of businesses creating profit in production, but out of people's income and out of people's money wealth. I call that financial expropriation, and it's characteristic of modern capitalism, I believe.
And is it all going to come to a sticky end?
The crisis that burst out in 2007, 2008 is very much a crisis of financialization, in my view. Think about it. How did the crisis begin? It began because of something called the subprime mortgages. In other words, mortgages obtained by just about the poorest people in the United States, the poorest section of the working class in the United States. Often people who, black and Latino workers and their families, or people who were not actually in the labor force, but they were black and Latino families and so on. They obtained mortgages to buy houses and to enter the so-called American dream. And then this development catalyzed a global crisis. Now, if you take a historical perspective, this is unbelievable. If you actually mention this to one of the great classical economists of the 19th century, that global capitalism would enter a gigantic crisis because some workers had borrowed money to buy houses, they would have laughed at you. And yet that's what we're going through. And that's a sign of how financialization has transformed the world and the kind of problematic outcomes it can create. People borrow to buy houses. These debts are then securitized. Games are played with them in the international markets. The end result is a gigantic crisis comes out of this. People lose their homes on an individual or household basis, and then a huge recession comes out of it. So, yes, it is a bad thing. Financialization of the household, but also of the economy as a whole, is a bad thing. And the argument today must be about reversing it. The left and progressive people must find ways of reversing this development.
And you argue in your book, which is Profiting Without Producing, published by Verso, the ways that we can do that. That's definitely a Christmas present I'll be buying for myself. Thanks very much indeed, Professor Costas Lapavitsas, Professor of Economy at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Ask